So this morning we're going to look kind of part one of the 18th century, which is really the rise of what we think of as the evangelical movement. Remember last week we talked about what was happening after the Reformation. You had in the German Lutheran churches that went into Scandinavia, you had the Pietist movement, which was really there are some good things about it, but one of the critiques is that it went away from Lutheran theology and more towards a theology of the heart, a theology of experience, individual piety, which again is a good thing, but at what cost? So that was one thing we saw. We also saw in continental Reformed theology, people like Francis Puritan and others really got into the marrow, the meat of Reformed theology and like spelling out what predestination looks like, spelling out God's eternal decrees. And they really got into some minutia there. We talked about the Synods of Dort as well, where you had Jacob Arminius, this is today in the Netherlands, Holland, who was trained under Beza, Calvin's successor in Geneva, and then came back to the Netherlands and was teaching as a professor and began to teach, God predestines because he foreknows. And that stirred up some controversy. He dies the early part of the 17th century, and then in 1619, the Synods of Dort comes up with what we today affectionately in some quarters call tulip, basically the five, what people think of as Calvinism, which is not, but God's sovereignty and our sin in tulip, total depravity, all that kind of stuff, perseverance of the saints. So that's what we talked about a little bit. We also talked about the Puritan movement. They're beginning to get persecuted. They're trying to purify the church from within, but yet they're beginning to flee, and they're coming over to what is eventually going to be America. And so they're fleeing for freedom. They go to Holland first, and they come here. And that leads us into the 18th century. And as we think about it, this, again, is the rise. The 18th century is the rise of what we see today as the evangelical movement, evangelical churches, the Evangelical Impulse. And it's helpful to know the context. The context is when you think about Christianity in the West, Christianity in Europe, in England, we can often think things are always better than they were now. It's terrible now. No one goes to church now. It's awful. America's going to hell. And it might. I don't know. We'll find out Tuesday night, right? When we think, sorry. It's going to be bad either way, right? When we think about 18th century in Western Europe, sorry for that aside, do not think that England was this pure spiritual Christian state. When you think of England, because this is really in the UK, in the West, where Christianity is really breaking ground and flourishing, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, you have to think of really a depraved England. In the sense of, in 1689, in England, they prohibited all imported liquor. And that led to the early part of the 18th century, what we're talking about now, which is called, affectionately now, the gin craze. And me and Edward used to talk about this a little bit when we were talking about the history of the English people. And basically, to quote here, Bishop Benson, an Anglican bishop, said, "Gin has made the English people what they never were before, cruel and inhuman. If it continues," this is from a London magistrate named Henry Fielding, "if the gin craze continues for another 20 years, there will hardly be left any common people to drink it." Every sixth house in England was producing gin. So basically, you have a people who feeling hopeless, feeling lost, feeling discouraged, and drinking themselves literally to death. So when we think today of some of the opioid crisis, fentanyl, those kind of drugs, that is really what they're experiencing, only they're just drinking themselves to death and killing their livers, killing themselves. And so with that comes an increase in crime. So crime is skyrocketing. So at the beginning of the 18th century, there are at least, in England, there are at least 160 offenses that are punishable by death. So you can think of one or two offenses that might be punishable by death, right? You murder someone in the parking lot at Derby, you should probably die for that, But 160 different offenses that are punishable by death seems a little extreme, but that's how bad the crime was, that's how bad the alcoholism was in England at the beginning of the 18th century. And so I want us to understand that because crime is up, drug abuse is up, and that is leading to a culture in the West, in West pre-America, where people are skeptical and cynical about Christianity. That is the context for the rise of the evangelical movement, where people, and this is what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about John Wesley, first of all. I'm going to try to be nice about Wesley. And then we're going to talk about Whitfield, because these are the two guys that bring two aspects of the evangelical movement to England. But you have to understand that England, Scotland, European West, this is not a flourishing Christian, everyone's going to church, everyone's Presbyterian, everyone's Baptist, everyone's Anglican. It's not. And without getting into it, the Anglican church is really not preaching the gospel. As we'll see that with Whitfield here in a minute, in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. They're not preaching the gospel. So that's the environment that Wesley grows up in 1703. And the reason we're focusing on Wesley first, the politically correct answer is he is the organizer. So as the evangelical movement rises, he is the one who is gifted with organizing and administrating what is happening with the evangelical movement. So that's why we're focusing on him. And his influence is really hard to underestimate. So he's born, his dad is an Anglican rector, they're poor. His brother Charles, who we sing some of his songs, is born in 1707. Skip through some of these notes here, got a lot of stuff about him. He survived a house fire as a little boy at 6, which is great. In 1720, he goes to Oxford to study, and and you see this throughout the history of the church, he tries to live a devout, pious life, following rules. In the history of the church, there's always a tendency, and this is probably going to come out wrong, but I'm going to say it, to make rules out of Christianity, and then if we follow them and live by them, we are good Christians. It happened all the way back to the 1st century, 2nd century, read Galatians, read Romans. Happens in the 3rd century with the Donatist movement. Wesley does the same thing. He has a list of rules, so I wrote some of them down in his diary. This is a 17-year-old John Wesley. He said, begin each day with God, don't sleep too much, be diligent, employ all your hours in religion, avoid drunkards and busybodies, and avoid useless employments. Examine yourself every night, at least 1 day for devotion, 1 hour a day, for devotions. Avoid temptation to light behavior, don't listen to idle talk. So he's coming up with all these rules to follow. And his friends are doing that, and they're fasting Wednesdays and Fridays at Oxford. And Whitfield's going to join this group later. We'll get to him in a second. They call it the Holy Club. You probably know that. They're studying the Greek New Testament that Erasmus, we talked about him, had produced 180 years earlier. Whitfield joins that group and is following. Wesley is the leader of this group. John Wesley is the leader. He is the full authority. We'll see that in a minute. That's his personality. And this is when they begin to be called Methodist, because they have a strict method to their life, to their study. So that's where the Methodist term first gets employed, and it's a pejorative. It's not a compliment. So early on, John Wesley is living a very work-centered life. And so at this point, he will admit later, he's not a Christian. He doesn't know grace. He's ordained a deacon in 1725 and then a priest in 1728, begins preaching thereafter. Later on, he'll say, early on in my ministry career, preaching, quote, preaching was defective and fruitless. From 1725 to 1729, I neither laid the foundation of repentance nor of preaching the gospel, taking it for granted that all whom I preached to were believers and needed no repentance. And then he says later on in the 1730s, he had a deeper foundation in his preaching and saw some fruit. So he begins to teach at Lincoln College, and then this is where it gets interesting. This is where his life turns around. He goes to Georgia. He sails from England, the UK, to Georgia, which is a colony created by James Oglethorpe for debtors and refugees. Still some of those there in Georgia today, in Gainesville. On the trip, they meet, so they're traveling over the Atlantic, they meet some Moravian missionaries. Okay, the Moravians are really followers of Luther with a very pious, experiential religion. In the midst of a heavy storm, the Moravians show great faith and piety, devotion to God, trust in God, and Wesley he's scared. Let's put it that way. I'm going to try to be nice to Wesley this morning. He's scared. And this is where the Moravian leader confronts John Wesley with the question, saying, the guy's name is Spangenberg. He's the Moravian leader. He says, do you know Jesus Christ? And Wesley says, well, he is the Savior of the world. And this Moravian leader says, do you know that he has saved you? Wesley doesn't know that. Wesley's preaching. He's been preaching for, at this point, just under a decade, more or less, in the Anglican Church. He doesn't know the gospel. So Wesley and his brother Charles, little brother Charles, show up in Georgia. Charles gives up within a year, less than a year. He's out of his element, not happy. John Wesley stays. And it's not a good situation for him. I put here, in a sermon given Sunday, March 21st, 1736 in Georgia. This would have been around Savannah. His sermon was disrupted by gunshots, and an irate, angry matron threatened to blow him up as a religious hypocrite. That was the reception. And someone cheered, "Go Dogs," in the back of the... That's the environment. And I'm just going to be blunt here. I think the person probably was closer to the truth from what we know about John Wesley at this point in his life. And here's why I say that. Wesley, this guy, let me just tell you the story. So he's trying to date this young woman in the church. She refuses and marries another guy, shows up to church, wants to have communion, and Wesley says no. Come on. That's pretty bad. One person wrote about John Wesley in Georgia. Actually, this is to him directly. It's second person. "I like nothing that you do. All your sermons are satires upon particular persons. Therefore, I will never hear you more. And all the peoples are of my mind. We won't hear ourselves abused." So what they're saying is, you're just preaching at people. You're just angry. "Indeed," quote, this is Georgia magistrate who says this. "Indeed, there is neither man nor woman in the town," this is around Savannah, I think, "who minds a word that you say." So Wesley encounters failure. He's at this point, more so than later years, he is a very, if you say something to him that doesn't take well, he comes at you. And you're going to hear about that a little bit more with George Whitfield. He's not a gracious, gospel-centered minister. So he fails. Goes back to London. That's where he meets Count Zinzendorf in London in 1737, meets Isaac Watts. We sing some of his hymns. And they talk about their desire for mission work with the Moravians. And this is really, and we're going to speed up here a little bit. This is where Wesley has a conversion experience. He's talking to them. He's talking to Zinzendorf. Count Zinzendorf, as a quick aside, he is the guy that I stole the idea from for concerts of prayer. So Zinzendorf and his Moravian group in what is today areas of Germany, basically...
Excuse me, what was his name again?
Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf. Count Zinzendorf. Yeah. Okay. Are you fact checking me here? What's going on?
I'm taking notes.
Okay, I'm just
Not
kidding.
doing Facebook.
I'm kidding. No communion. Zinzendorf is the one me and Charlie actually stole the idea from for concerts of prayer. So Zinzendorf and the Moravian group, they started a concert of prayer that lasted for, I think I've written about this a little bit or put on Facebook or something, lasted for over a century, where people in the church, where someone in the church was praying constantly for over a century, and it led to, I don't know the number, I didn't look it up, dozens and dozens and dozens of global missionaries to India, to Turkey, to the West Indies, to South Africa, and all that stuff. And so it's in this context where Wesley is confronted with a man who says, basically he challenges Wesley's views and his beliefs. And so Wesley's struggling with this. And at this point, Wesley visits a prisoner who's waiting to be executed. And the prisoner, this is an amazing story, rose from prayer before being executed, and the prisoner told those that were with them, quote, "I am now ready to die. I know Christ has taken away my sins, and there is no more condemnation for me." Wesley's watching this. I don't think Wesley is a Christian. He's the chaplain. So Wesley's seeing a man who will be executed, and is executed in front of him, who is at peace. That's pretty remarkable. A friend tells Wesley, "Preach faith till you have it, and then because you have it, you will preach it." And so that leads to 1738, the Aldersgate experience, where he's studying Luther's commentary with some friends. He leaves that. This is in London, near St. Paul's Cathedral. He leaves that and he writes, quote, "I felt my heart strangely warmed." That's his conversion experience. He's studying Luther's commentary on Romans and what it means to know Christ and the gospel. And so he begins to preach. He's urged, we'll get to Whitfield in a second, George Whitfield, he's urged to preach in open air, lower class parts of society, and he does. And he's kind of criticized for that because you didn't really do that in the Anglican Church. And that's where he says, "The world is my parish." And that's a big slogan in the Methodist Church, still today. Then he takes a trip in 1738 to visit the Moravians, and he visits the city where Johann Sebastian Bach is the director of music, which is pretty cool, a little historical interaction. There's no record that they met, but he's in the churches where Bach is composing and writing the music. So here's what I want you to see from Wesley, because we're going to skip some of this stuff here. Wesley has a gift for organization and administration. So and we're going to talk about Whitfield in a second. Whitfield is the original leader. Whitfield takes this rising Methodist movement, this kind of renewal movement in the Church of England, the Anglican movement, and he organizes it, and he leads it. And there is no leader but Wesley. If you disagree with him, you're out, essentially. He doesn't tolerate different opinions. And so he leads this group, and he's getting different people to join the Methodist movement and meet in different classes and small groups. And he's encouraged to do this by his mother, Susanna, who's encouraging him to do this. And part of the context of Wesley's rise at this point is that George Whitfield, as a workaholic, is traveling back and forth to the colonies and back to England, preaching and teaching and doing revival and raising money for an orphanage in Savannah. Whitfield is gone. Whitfield's on the move. And so that allows Wesley to coalesce a Methodist movement in England and become the de facto leader of it. And he is. And he is basically an acting bishop. So in 1776, while we were writing our declaration, there was a conference, a Wesleyan group conference in Great Britain, that asserted that the greatest hindrance to God's work in Britain, this is factual, the greatest hindrance to God's work in Britain was the Calvinist expression of faith. Wesley comes out and says this. We're going to talk about this more in a minute. So Wesley is picking a fight with the Reformed, with the Presbyterians, with Whitfield. We'll get to that in a second. Because he despises the Presbyterian theology, the Reformed theology, and he takes issue with it publicly and openly and starts a fight. He begins to act like a bishop. He personally ordains 2 men to be bishops. Wesley had no right to do that. He had no ecclesiastical authority to do that. He ordains Thomas Coke to be a superintendent in America, to travel around and recruit people to join their movement. Wesley, the main thing we can say about him is he was diligent, he was organized, he was an administrator who knew how to put things together apart from the Roman Catholic Church. He knew how to organize. So by the time that he dies in 1790, there are around 72,000 Methodists in Great Britain. He's traveling 5,000 miles a year. He's given 15 sermons a week. He's a little dude. This is a great story. I had to put this in here before we go on to Whitfield. One of the criticisms of Wesley, apart from his personality, is when he was about almost 50 years old, he married this widow. And it was really kind of a black mark on his life because their marriage was a train wreck. And I will tell you why. She would be alone for weeks as he's working and he's traveling, he's doing all this stuff. And she began to get suspicious because she's opening up his mail and she's seeing all these letters from different women all over the place. Oh, I loved your message. I love your whatever, this or that. And she begins to get suspicious. She accuses him of adultery. He tells her bluntly, be quiet, submit, be content to be a, quote, private, insignificant individual. Great guy. John Hampson, these are all true stories. John Hampson, a friend from Manchester, recorded that he once entered a room to find Molly Wesley, his wife, dragging John across the floor by his hair. That's why I mentioned he was a little man. He was a little dude. And John could be mean. I mean, she was mean, obviously, too. She's dragging him across. He wrote her one time, this is a true story, quote, John Wesley wrote his wife, Molly, quote, if you were buried just now, or if you had never lived, what loss would it be to the cause of God? I'm just going to keep going. When she left him, so she deserted the marriage in 1771. So we're working on independence over here. Jefferson's getting things going. Madison. She's leaving him. Quote, he writes when she leaves in 1771, I did not forsake her, I did not dismiss her, and I will not recall her. So, pretty horrific marriage. He was not a friendly person to her. But his legacy is the guy worked and worked and worked. He organized, and what he brought to the rise of the evangelical movement is a level of organization and administration that others are going to take and use to apply to the evangelical movement. Because you have to think, the evangelical movement is not like the Roman Catholic Church where you have a pope, you have archbishops, and it kind of descends and it's all organized. This is all kind of laissez-faire, hands-off, wide open with the Protestant movement. And so Wesley brings the organization to it. So his legacy was taken on by Francis Asbury, that's Asbury College up in Kentucky maybe, where they would not really, Francis Asbury had no seminary training. He arrives in 1771. There were 300 Methodists in America enrolled, and by his death in the early part of the 19th century, there are over 300,000 Methodists. So a very important movement. The key here is Wesley was an organizer, administrator, to get people together for the same cause. The catalyst for getting those numbers, the catalyst for communicating the evangelical movement is George Whitfield. He's born in Gloucester, England. His parents run an inn called The Bell. And he does a typical thing, hangs out with punks as a young kid, and gets serious about Christianity at age 17, goes to Oxford. And at Oxford, it's where he meets the Wesleys. But you have to know this about Whitfield. Whitfield entered Oxford, the lowest possible category of society, called a servitor. So he would serve the other students. He would serve the Wesleys, meaning you wake them up in the morning, you run their errands, help them with breakfast, you make sure their shoes are blackened, you clean their rooms. High-ranking students at the highest class would not be allowed to talk to Whitfield because he was poor. So he joins this holy club with the Wesleys and follows John's leadership. And they're ascetic. They're not eating. They're fasting twice a week. They're not drinking much water. And Whitfield's health deteriorates. So he's confined to his bed for 7 weeks. He's starting to read some Puritans. He's starting to read some stuff. And finally, he's ordained in 1736, June of 1736. And he preaches his first sermon a week later, June 27th, from Ecclesiastes 4. And after the sermon, someone wrote the bishop and said that his sermon drove 15 people mad. And by mad, 18th century, that means excited, enraged, they didn't lose their minds, but people were stirred up by his preaching. It's interesting, though, throughout Whitfield's career, he never, even starting then, he never had an altar call, which becomes kind of the hallmark of the Billy Sunday, Billy Graham revivalistic movement, the Second Great Awakening in the 19th century. And so here he begins preaching in the 1730s, and very quickly he becomes a success because he transitions from preaching just word by word reading to just extemporaneous preaching. And he's very good at it, as you have probably read. And he's preaching in the context of the gin craze we talked about earlier. People are drinking themselves to death. And the clergy, the Anglican clergy in England, are not known for their piety and their holiness. A century later, Bishop J.C. Ryle will say that the clergy, when they did preach, their sermons were so unspeakably and indescribably bad that it is comforting to reflect that they were generally preached to empty benches. So J.C. Ryle, a century later, says the Anglican clergy were so bad, the only good thing about it was nobody was there to hear it. So that's the Church of England in the early 18th century. So their clergy are known for gambling, farming, drinking, shooting, hunting, everything but preaching, with a few exceptions. So Whitfield is gaining a following as he's preaching, and people want to hear him. And his sermons are getting a lot of attention. He begins to preach open air in Bristol, England. And he's preaching to miners, working class people. And he's preaching to 50 people, and very soon that turns, in the weeks and months ahead, turns to 5,000 people that are gathering outside to hear him. And that's when he urges Wesley, hey, Wesley, you should try this open air preaching thing. And Whitfield had gotten this idea from a Welsh revivalist named Howell Harris, who was a converted preacher. And that preacher was converted. I found this interesting. Howell Harris, the guy who taught Whitfield to do this, he was converted when someone said, if you are not fit to come to the Lord's table, you are not fit to live, and you are not fit to die. And that convicted a Welshman named Howell Harris to convert to the gospel and begin open air preaching, and he mentors and teaches George Whitfield. Great, great line. If you are not fit for the Lord's table, you're not fit to live, and you are not fit to die. Wow, that's pretty. Might squeeze that in at 10:30. So Wesley shows up in Bristol, hears Whitfield preach in 1737, and says, quote, the churches will not contain the multitudes that will throng to hear George Whitefield. He is right, and I think when Wesley said that, this is my own personal opinion, I think he was jealous. Because you see that later in their career. He's jealous. Wesley wants what Whitfield has. So in 1737, according to Mark Knoll, who I think is still at Notre Dame, as a historian, church historian, from August 1737 until December 30th, Whitfield preached over 100 times and became the biggest celebrity in and around London. And he's 22 years old. Pretty remarkable. He's the biggest celebrity. Everyone knows George Whitfield. He's 22 because he's preaching to these crowds, and he's just such a great preacher. And by the accounts we have, he would basically, as he entered the pulpit to preach or entered outside to preach, he kind of worked himself into it. And I mean that in a good sense. He would begin to preach, and it would just kind of overpower him, and he would kind of take on the mantle of this revivalist. So he goes to Bristol. He's preaching in Bristol. 40 to 50,000 people a week are coming to hear him. Whitfield, though, is a guy who likes to stay on the move. He likes to travel and preach. So he generously says, I'm going to leave Bristol, where he's got 40 to 50,000 people a week, and says, Wesley, I want you to take this on. I'm going to travel to the colonies. I'm going to travel to the American colonies. And Whitfield tells, I'm going to emphasize this for my own benefit, Whitfield tells Wesley, do not pick a fight when I leave. Do not pick a fight on predestination. It's not worth it. Preach the gospel. Don't pick a fight. A month later, Wesley preaches a sermon called Free Grace and calls out the Calvinist views of Whitfield. A month later. So Whitfield, it took 11 weeks to get from the UK, or Great Britain at that point, I guess, to America. Whitfield's not even in America yet, and Wesley has already broken that vow. So I'm trying to give you a clear picture of Wesley, what the guy was up to. Wesley calls it, in the sermon to thousands of people, he says, predestination is a doctrine full of blasphemy, a horrible decree. Whitfield, when he finds out about it, writes him, quote, he says, Wesley, honored sir, if you have any regard for the peace of the church, keep it from your sermon on predestination. Don't preach on predestination. Later, Whitfield writes, how can I avoid opposing you, Wesley, if you go about it, as your brother Charles said, trying to drive Calvin out of Bristol? He says, how can I oppose you when you're openly, instead of just preaching the gospel, you're actively preaching against predestination and against Calvinist views? Whitfield also says, surely, whether or not as a judge, he says, whether or not a greater blasphemy to say, quote, Christ died for souls now in hell. He says, surely, Wesley, you do not believe there will be a delivery of damned souls from hell hereafter, or that you would study the covenant of grace. I find that your sermon has had its expected success and has set the nation disputing. So it's a little bit, some awkward English there. He's basically saying you're preaching a Christ that has died for those that are not receiving him. And you're stirring up controversy amongst the nation, and you don't have to. You don't need to. Why are you doing that? About this time and a little bit after that, there's the first martyr of the Methodist movement, a guy named William Seward, a follower of Whitfield, who's preaching in Wales. And he's attacked by a mob in the field where he's preaching and struck by a heavy stone from close range. And he dies a few days later at age 38 and buried in the churchyard there. And his epitaph says, to die is gain, from Apostle Paul. So you see some opposition there and a preacher getting executed, essentially. So Whitfield, he's going to London, then he goes to America in 1739. He goes along the coast. Remember, in 1739, most they're not really Americans, they're citizens of the Great Britain, are living pretty much on the coast, coastal living. The population is under 1 million in the colonies. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia are the largest cities with 12,000 to 14,000 citizens. Charleston's kind of a second-tier city, 6,000 to 8,000 people, so a bustling city. A lot happening in Charleston. But 6,000 in Charleston would be pretty nice today. I mean, you could just go wherever and not have traffic. So America at this point, Cotton Mather in Boston, minister in Boston, says in 1706, he says, it is confessed by all who know anything of the matter that there is a horrible decay of Christianity in America among professors of it. The modern Christianity is too general, but a very scarce shadow of the ancient. A sinful nation, children that are corrupters, notorious decay. So again, in Cotton Mather's probably a little bit more uptight than we would be in Boston. But he's basically saying America, it was not 1706 what the Puritans wanted it to be. It was not this bustling Christian culture. There were Christians, there were vibrant Christians, but there was also a rejection of Christianity. So I say that because sometimes we think it was always perfect in the past, and it really wasn't. Whitfield does a tour of New England, Philadelphia, New York, all that stuff. He's preaching 2 or 3 times a day. It really is remarkable. A Boston listener at the Boston Commons wrote, after hearing him preach, quote, "To have seen him when he first commenced, one would have thought him anything but enthusiastic and glowing. But as he proceeded and preached, his heart warmed with his object and his manner, until, forgetful of everything around him, he seemed to kneel. Whitfield seemed to kneel at the throne of God and to beseech in agony his fellow being." So there you see, he gets into the sermon as he's preaching it and begins to just preach. And he's got a voice that is just unbelievable by all accounts. I skipped over, you guys know the Ben Franklin account. Franklin talks about it in Philadelphia. Then Whitfield goes to Massachusetts. He goes to the home of Jonathan Edwards. We'll talk about him next week. Edwards' wife, Sarah, says this. She says, quote, "Whitfield is a born orator. You've already heard of his deep tone yet clear, melodious voice. It is perfect music. It is wonderful to see what a spell he casts over an audience by proclaiming the simple truths of the Bible. I have seen upwards of 1,000 people hang on his words with silence, broken only by an occasional sob." So there you see a man who, my point here is, gifted with, God has given him abilities to speak that none of us have. And he uses it. He uses it well. And all he's doing is working. He's traveling. He's up and down from Savannah to New Hampshire today, I guess. This is interesting. In 1739, he preaches his first sermon in Charleston, South Carolina. He preaches at a meeting house, a dissenters' meeting house, so it's not a Church of England or Anglican church, because he did not have permission. And then one of the interesting things, and this comes from Arnold Dallymore's 2-volume biography of George Whitfield. In 1740, he's in Charleston for a second time, and he is opposed by the rector of St. Philip's downtown, a guy by the name of Alexander Garden, who begins to write letters to other clergy attacking Whitfield's character and doctrine. Whitfield wasn't popular with the clergy, the Anglican clergy, because he's calling them out for their sin and calling them out because they're not preaching the gospel. And he's not just confining himself to St. Philip's or St. Michael's or St. Andrew's or wherever. He is going out to the fields. So Whitfield was forbidden from preaching in the Anglican churches here. So in July of 1740, Whitfield is in Charleston. He attends worship at St. Philip's. Not the one today. There have been a couple fires, but same spot, right? And the rector, Alexander Garden, gives a sermon where he attacks Whitfield and refuses him the sacrament. Southern hospitality. It's ridiculous. Then this rector holds a church ecclesiastical court, which there had not been one in the Church of England, a church court hearing in the colonies. This guy calls one, Alexander Garden, because he wants to convict Whitfield of views that are opposed to the Church of England. And he's, quote, concerned about the health of Whitfield's soul, which is not true. And they say Whitfield is not following the form of prayer prescribed by the Anglican Church, which is the real charge. They're saying he's not following, when he preaches in Baptist churches or Presbyterian churches, he's not following the form of prayer in the book used by the Church of England. Whitfield, the great thing about him, he continues to preach. He does not care. He does not care what Garden says down at St. Philip's. In July of 1740, this was cool for me. This was cool years ago when I first preached there. He preaches his first sermon out at John's Island at the Presbyterian Church there, which is still there. He preaches twice, and they still have the whole setup there up front where he was, which is pretty cool. The next week, as he preaches there at John's Island Pres, I'm not sure they would let him preach there now. The next week, he returns to St. Philip's, and the rector again goes after him in his sermon. And the rector of St. Philip's compares Whitfield to a family, the Dutart family, great name, who, the Dutart family, I think they've been erased from Charleston history, had been basically removed from Charleston a decade and a half earlier because they had really crazy religious views. They lived like outlaws. They were guilty of murder and incest, and members of the family were convicted and hung. Whitfield sits in a sermon at St. Philip's, downtown Charleston, and hears himself compared to those people. It's crazy. It's crazy. And then we're going to skip some of this, but they have a church court hearing, and they accuse him of all this stuff. And Whitfield basically says, "Once you tell me once you can prove you have authority over me, I'll answer. But I'm just showing up here. I'm not going to answer you," and leaves. I mean, he basically just blows it off, which is great because they had no authority over him. A year later, Garden reconvenes his court after he finds out that the leadership of the Anglican Church back in Canterbury and London doesn't care. Like, they don't care. He reconvenes the court a year later and censures Whitfield and says he's denounced publicly and openly in the face of the church. He should be punished and suspended from his office. Whitfield doesn't care. He just keeps preaching wherever they'll have him. Whitfield leaves Charleston to go north, and he says this about Charleston. He says, 1740, "At my first coming to Charleston, the people of Charleston seemed to be wholly devoted to pleasure. At my first coming, the people of Charleston seemed to be wholly devoted to pleasure." That's 1740. So let's not be idealistic about what happened in the past. There were some sinners back then too. He says, quote, "One well acquainted with their manners and circumstances told me that people spent more of their money on polite entertainments than the amount raised for the poor." I'll let that one just hang there. Whenever Whitfield returns to Charleston, he's going to worship with the Presbyterians and the Baptists. That's where he finds a home. It's interesting, as a side note here, Wesley John Wesley sent that controversial sermon I mentioned earlier, Free Grace, where he picks the fight on predestination. He sent a copy of it after this happened to Alexander Garden of St. Philip's. And that's how Wesley finds out about it. So I share that because it's a little bit of an insight into two things, to be serious. Two things. One, Wesley is picking fights with people he doesn't have to because he wants full control. Second thing is it's just another example of the opposition Whitfield faced. The guy he gave the ministry to in Bristol and said, "Hey, here's 50,000 people, handle this," still picks a fight with him. So when we think about Whitfield, we think about his ministry. The guy is an unbelievable man. He faced all kinds of opposition, even from his own friends, which is just hard to read about, that Wesley would do this. Wesley has it published, has this sermon, Free Grace, published in Philadelphia and Boston. And interestingly, Wesley begins to publish also some stuff from Jonathan Edwards, but then he just takes out some of the Calvinistic stuff and edits it out. So to finish up on Whitfield very quickly, and then next week we're going to kind of wrap it up and tie in some loose ends and bring in the ARP to all of this. In 1742, Whitfield is back in Scotland. He's preaching to crowds of 20,000. In Glasgow, he's preaching to crowds of 30,000, which is remarkable when you understand that that's twice the population of the town. Like, people are coming everywhere to hear him because of his style, but also his content. He's the only person that century who preached in Great Britain, the American colonies, and in the islands around Bermuda. He preaches everywhere. And he says, the Christian world is in a deep sleep. Nothing but a loud voice can waken them out of it. And he dies at age 55 because he worked himself to death. If you read the story, he dies. He's about an hour and a half north of Boston. It's a really cool church if you're ever up there to visit, Newburyport, Massachusetts. They would not let him preach there today. He preaches one last sermon because they want him to preach outside the house right next door to the church. It's just to the right of the church. And they call him out of his room, and he's not feeling well, and he's holding a candle, and he preaches on the steps there of that house until the candle goes out. And then he dies shortly thereafter. At that church he built. I mean, he built it. And he's staying right next to it. And you can go visit. He's buried, hopefully this isn't too dark. He's buried underneath the church. And you can actually, if the guy that I went there when I was in seminary and visited it, you can actually get underneath the church and see kind of the crypt where he's buried. It's a cool New England little town. But again, they would not let him preach there today. They would riot and mob if he was preaching there, based on what the church believes today. So here's my point. Wesley, in the Rise of the Evangelical Movement, is the organizer, the administrator who knows how to put things together and is a model for future leaders. Whitfield is the one who says, here's the style. We've got to preach aggressively. We've got to preach with some character, with some style, with not just put people to sleep. There's only one thing missing in that. You've got the organization, you've got the communication. You don't have the theology component to it. That's where Jonathan Edwards comes in. We'll talk about him next week. He's the one that's going to bring the theology. And as we think about the last thought here is if you were living in that time in South Carolina and Charleston, spending more on entertainment than on for the poor, according to the former Wofford historian from 50 years ago, Lewis Smith, this is from his book, if you were living here the early part of the 18th century in Charleston or Mount Pleasant or Wadmalaw or wherever you were, 42% of the area would have been Anglican. I don't know what it is now. 45% of South Carolina, of Charleston, would have been Calvinist. The majority of the people were Presbyterian Calvinists at the start of the 18th century. 10% were Baptists, and 2.5, it's always important to have that 0.5 in there, were Quaker. That was South Carolina at the start of the 18th century. So Presbyterians, we were doing great before the war, the Revolutionary War. 45%. Baptists were at 10%, Anglicans at 42%, Quakers at 2.5%. And things are going to dramatically change, really with the war. That's a big part of it, and some of the educational stuff. So I'm going to stop there. Are there any, real quickly, any thoughts or questions